Hey guys, Brian here from Better Chess Training, and in today's video we're going to be continuing our little mini series on Mikhail, and this is actually a game from his World Championship match against Mikhail Botvinnik. It's Game 19, and well, check it out. Hey guys, I hope you have been enjoying my little series on Mikhail, and in this game I selected the 19th game from his World Championship match with Mikhail Botvinnik. I looked through a bunch of games trying to decide which one to do, and this one I found was very interesting because it actually shows us, besides being an amazing tactician and attacker, that Tao was actually very good at strategy and planning as well, and you'll see that throughout this game. I also thought it was a nice instructive game using an opening which you haven't seen in a while, and that's the Dutch defense. Okay, well, let's get started here. Tao played c4, and at this point he is leading by several points in the match for the World Championship. Of course, Botvinnik is the defending world champion here, and so he plays something which is in his repertoire, but was a little provocative here, and it's the Dutch defense. Of course, at this time it was already known that this is not necessarily the most solid way to play with black, but Tao speculated that that Botvinnik had to unbalance the position and play something a little sharper, and he actually praised the choice because in this match there weren't many games left, this being game 19. So Tao continues with knight to f3, black plays knight to f6, and standard choice here is g3, and this is bien-kettoing the light square bishop tends to be the preferred way to play against the Dutch, or I guess in a lot of the main lines. So here, this was the second surprise. Botvinnik was well known for his solid Stonewall Dutch, and here he employs instead the sharper Leningrad formation, and probably because of his current standing in the match. Similar to the King's Indian defense, this bishop's going to come to g7, and then he's going to push these pawns in the center, and this bishop can become a monster at some point. Similarly, a lot of times this f pawn can, followed up by the g pawn, can open up things on the king side so that black can have a king side attack. Of course, this also entails some risk because, as you can see here, the pawns around black's king, after he castles on the king side, is also compromised. So that's kind of the general layout of this opening. So let's see how it proceeds. White plays bishop to g2, bishop to g7 is played, and white plays d4, transposing to one of the main lines of the Dutch at the time. Okay, black plays d6, and in general this is preparing this e5 pawn break at some point, as well as freeing up the light square bishop, and potentially this bishop or this knight can also go to the d7 square. Okay, knight to c3 is played, and here e6 is played, and this is one of the main moves here. Typically castling is more common, but the problem here is that d5 can be played, and black can fight back with c6. And in this position, although probably objectively it's probably okay for black, because of this space and this disruption of the advance of this e-pawn, white has scored very well here in master practice. However, overall, I think it is probably fine for black, especially if you look at it with an engine for a little bit. You can see that black has a lot of opportunities to attack this pawn. In any case, not to veer off too much, black does play e6 to prevent this. Okay, white castles and black castles. White plays queen to c2, and the general idea here is that we're going to start eyeing this e4 square, which is going to become important, and it generally is very important for for black. If white allows it, black eventually, maybe followed by something like d5, can play his knight here to e4. Okay, black plays knight to c6, and white plays rook to d1. Black plays queen to e7, and here rook to b1 is played. So of course now we're signaling that we're, well, a couple of reasons actually. We're getting off this diagonal where this bishop at some point after some exchanges can be very effective. Also, we are looking at perhaps playing b2 to b4. And so with that in mind, black plays a5, keeping an eye, clamping down on this b4 square, and to prevent any potential incursion, and also preparing b2 to b4, white plays a3 himself. Okay, knight to d8 is played, and here, because this knight is no longer putting any pressure on the d4 square, Hal takes the opportunity to strike in the center. Now, he was playing on the queen side, but he sees this opportunity. At some point, e4 is preferred to be played by white at some point, and here is a great time to play it. Now, what is the idea here? Well, this helps to fight for the center. This f5 pawn has this grip on this e4 square, and it does open up this file for black, which allows a lot of counterplay sometimes, but it also opens up the e file for white, and so this helps to release some potential energy or provide some potential energy for white's attack. So we'll see how it plays out, but pretty much black has to play as he did in the game, taking on e4. Let me just give you an example here. If Mikhail gives this line, e5 here, trying to fight for some space as well as freeing this bishop, doesn't quite work out here. And here's an example here. Bishop to g5, pinning this knight, and then if c6, c5 was Tal's intention. And I'm getting most of these notes from Tal's book on this match, 1960 World Championship match. I'll put the link in the description below, but this was a great book, and I really love the insight into Tal's thought process, which part of which I'll share here. But I'm elaborating on some of his notes, because some of his notes he might stop at a certain point, and I'm explaining it. So let's keep going here. In fact, he stops here saying that this favors white, and I'm going to show you a couple lines to show you why here. For example, of course, black can't take on c5 because now white attacks this, is going to win a piece here by attacking this pinned knight. Let's look at a couple other lines here. E takes d4 has a similar problem. In this case, we can attack the queen with this pawn, and if the queen takes back, now we can fork the queen and the knight. So, and do I have any other? If black tries to unpin this knight, then with something like queen to c7, for example, again we have c takes d6, and of course if queen takes d6, d takes e5, forking the queen and the knight. So this just gives you some examples of why something like e5, which is also a thematic move, and here just doesn't work tactically. So after e4, black does take here with the f pawn. Okay, well, knight takes e4, knight takes e4, and queen takes e4. So here we can take stock. Materials even. Black has this half-open f-file, which is fairly common here in the Dutch, and white has this half-open d-file. When it comes to looking at the pieces and the development, basically white still needs to develop this bishop on c1, but if we look here, black has two pieces, the knight and the bishop, that need to be developed. So looking at other concepts here, we also have space advantage. You see these white is controlling more space, and that is cramping some of these pieces. With that in mind, what white or what black really wants to do is he wants to play this e5 break, and that would free the bishop. And also there is a slight threat here, or after a little bit of playing this bishop out to f5 with this skewer. So we'll see that here momentarily. Well, actually, he cannot play e5 right away, even though that is what the position eventually is calling for. And I'm going to show you why here. After e5, d takes e5, and then if bishop to f5, skewering the queen and knight, we have this in-between check, queen to d5 check, and this is pretty dangerous for black, and white can gain a pretty solid advantage. So let me just show you a line here, king to h8, then we have e takes d6. If queen takes d6, we're going to exchange queens, and then we could just move this rook out of the bishop's firing line here. And basically, white is just up a solid pawn, and black doesn't have too much compensation. This pawn on d6 is weak, and because the queens are gone, a lot of black's attacking potential is also gone. So e5 couldn't be played right away. But let's go back here to the position in the game. Queen takes, after queen takes e4, black has to prepare it with knight to f7. And here, what I'd like you to do is actually pause the video, and I'll give you a few seconds here. Pause the video and think about this fight, this idea here that black wants to play e5, and try to think about what Tal played next. Okay, I hope you had a chance to think about it. A really nifty move here. He played bishop to h3. And there's a few good moves, but thematically, this is just in line with what Powell is trying to do. And the idea here is he's got like a little mini pin here on this e pawn. For example, if e5 is played, then bishop takes c8. And here, actually analyzing this, I thought that we just win this pawn here on e7, but it just depends. For example, rook takes f8, rook f takes c8, and then we have queen takes b7, and after e takes d4, knight takes d4, and say a move like a4, we can just retreat this queen here, and we're up a pawn. Now, black might have some compensation for the pawn because he's got these active pieces. He's got the e5 square, but a pawn is a pawn. Now, tactically, it is a little bit different if black takes with the a rook. And let me show you why. If we try to take it here, queen takes b7, then black gets a lot of counterplay here with e takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, and then if rook takes d4, queen to e1 check is strong. Of course, king to g2 is forced. And now here, knight to g5 with this f2 square being threatened is very dangerous. Now, black's not going to checkmate white here. We have queen to d5 check, and I know this is a long variation, but I just want to show you how complex this is. King to d8, and now rook to f4, because we can't just take this knight because f2 is hanging here. Rook takes f4, g takes f4, and knight takes e4. White, after queen to d4 check, this is about even because black's king is safe now. The queen is covering the f2 square, but black has a lot of counterplay. This rook is coming into the well, so white has some problems here, but in probably an even game. But if we just go back here, after bishop takes c8, rook to 8 takes c8, after a move like bishop to e3, I think white can still claim a slight advantage. He's got a little bit better development. He's got pressure on this 5 pawn, and these exchanges here would think benefit white. Again, that's partly Tal's assessment and partly the chess engine assessment as well. But very complex position. So let's go back here. After bishop to h3, black plays queen to f6. Of course, Botvinnik is the world champion, so he's going to play. He's not going to play the He's going to play very tough moves here. Bishop to d2. Got an eye here on the a5 pawn, but also just developing. Eventually going to try to develop here to c3 probably. And here, black makes his first strategic error, and he plays e5. And here, Hal suggests he should play c6 instead, protecting the b7 pawn against this queen and preparing this e5 push. Some analysis, though: bishop to c3, e5, bishop takes c8, rook takes c8, d takes e5, and d takes e5. After c5, I think white can still claim a slight advantage here because this e5 pawn can become weak. We are locking the pawn in place as well as covering the d6 square, so this knight not allowed to escape or to get to d6. So here, even though Tal recommended this for black, I still think it's pretty good for white. Here, bishop to d2. Here, black plays d5, and white does not exchange. Of course, c takes d5 is going to be a problem, because e takes d5, we've got this hanging bishop as well as this attack on this queen. So after the queen retreats or takes that pawn, black will grab the bishop on h3. So instead, white drops back to c2, protecting, of course, this pawn here on 4. D takes c4, and bishop to f4 first, attacking the pawn on c6. And the idea is we don't need to take this pawn on d4 right away. Knight to d6, protecting the pawn. But if we wanted to, we can take that off. But this bishop is very strong here on f4, and we're going to keep it. And here, knight to g5. And the idea here is, instead of trading pawns, or I'm sorry, this knight for the bishop, we're going to trade it for the knight. Now here you may think, well, knight to e5 is strong, and that is true, but I think this is one of those cases where, if you put this in the engine, it's going to say knight to e5 is probably the best move. But this is where Hal actually has a plan here, and the plan is to exchange these knights, game position, exchange these knights, and then be able to use these bishops to put pressure on these pawns and these squares here on the queen side. And with that kind of strategic concept in mind, he plays what he plays. And I think in our own games too, we can't worry about, when we're analyzing our games, not worry about what the computer says is the best move, especially in more strategic or positional games. Instead, we have to think about our plans. And as long as there's no tactical errors in our plans where our opponent can win a lot of material, it's better to think that way, I think, instead of worrying too much about what the computer thinks. Unless you have a coach who can maybe show you why positionally certain moves are better, or maybe confirm or understand why the engine suggests certain moves. I think these types of moves here, like what Tal plays, not the best move according to the engine, but he actually has a definite plan and can see ahead that he's going to have an advantage. I think that's the best way to go, and so I'm not going to criticize this much, because Hal, after all, has a plan to go with here. So knight to g5 and rook to e8 is played, protecting the e6 pawn another time, and bishop to g2. And so this bishop did its job on h3, and now he is targeting this diagonal, long diagonal. Rook to a6. Now, the idea here is that, let's just go back a move here. If you think about it, this bishop is the only piece that hasn't been developed by black, and by putting this bishop on g2, he's kind of making it a little awkward here to develop. And let me just give you an example. For example, bishop to d7, then white trades those bishops, or those knights. After bishop takes e4, if Black wants to play the natural developing move, bishop to c6, to get to trade bishops. Then this pawn structure, you can see all of these pawns are weak now, and Black's going to lose at least two of them fairly quickly. Of course, this isn't the best move. Let me just show you one move here. He takes c4. Of course, going back here, bishop to c6 is not the best move for Black, but I just wanted to show you the awkwardness that Black has here in trying to develop. So with that in mind, this kind of helps to explain the rook to a6, because now this rook gets out of this pin, unpins the b pawn, but also Black wants to advance the b pawn, and the c6 square can become very weak, and so that's why this rook. Okay, knight to e4, so Black trades, and here he plays b4. You can see here that the c6 square would have been a nice spot here to win this b pawn if rook were not on a6. But instead, now White plays very well with b3, hacking this pawn structure, and here White is going to be able to win a pawn. Okay, after he takes b3, queen takes b5 is the accurate move, gaining a tempo because he's attacking this rook here on e8. So the rook has to move, and now he can just grab this pawn on b3. So right now, material is even, but we can see here this c pawn is very weak. And even though this, you could say this d pawn is weak too, the only piece is attacking it, the lead piece attacking it is the queen, so it is protected quite well by this rook. Okay, Black gets this rook to b6 in, and the queen just goes here to 3. Little trade here of rooks, and here just to show you, rook takes e1 is not a bad move, but queen takes d4 grabs a pawn. So even though the engine as well as our common sense can tell us that Black is still, or I'm sorry, White probably still has an advantage because the c7 pawn is going to fall as well. We don't need to give away pawns necessarily. So instead, bishop takes 1, and this allows Black to develop this bishop to b7. Okay, now here you might be asking, why don't we take on c7? And the problem is that Black, despite the fact that White has a positional advantage, Black does have some compensation because he's got these got this battery coming down the f file, and this bishop is very well placed on b7. And let me just show you what I analyzed. Bishop takes c7, and now Tal actually gives bishop to h6, and here we can see how dangerous this is. Of course, if we take here, then it is checkmate. Queen takes f2, checkmate. After bishop to h6, if we try to stay in contact here, queen to f3 is going to lead to checkmate as well. So we want to grab that pawn, but we have to watch out for tactics. So instead, he plays bishop to a2, pressuring this 6 pawn, and this is going to force this trade of this dangerous light square bishop of Black. And well, Black played bishop to d5, but let me show you what happens here if rook takes, if rook to e8, trying to protect that pawn. White has a lot of good moves. Let me show you a couple ideas. The main idea here is that d5, attacking this pinned pawn because this rook is hanging, is going to be good. For example, queen to d8 and then queen to c5, putting some pressure. There's potential discoveries here along this diagonal, potential discoveries along this file, although right now this rook is hanging. And of course, we're continuing to put pressure here on the c7 pawn. So this is good for White. Going back here, we also have rook to b1, so a computer move, attacking this bishop first, and then after the bishop retreats, again playing d5, and just an attractive position. For example, e5, and then bishop to g5. Here, White has a huge initiative. This d6 covered check is going to be powerful as well. So with that in mind, it pretty much, if we go back here, pretty much forces bishop to e5, and white is happy to exchange here. Now, if we look at the resulting position, actually let's play a couple more moves. Now, black can take this because there's a little less danger here because of there's no more bishop here on this long diagonal. Black plays a4, and the idea behind that is to, of course, it was being attacked, but now it's on a light square where this bishop can't attack it, and it also, you can see here that white's pawns are on the dark squares where black's bishop can attack them. So you could say here that black has some compensation for white's extra pawn here. Let's take a little stock here. If, for example, black can trade queens, for example, with a move like queen to f3, then these pawns could become very vulnerable to black's dark square bishop. However, if and Tal talks about this strategically, if he can trade these bishops, then now that extra pawn on the king side can be very dangerous with some advances, and with these heavy pieces, there could actually be something of an attack on black, which white can use to perhaps win more material, maybe win another pawn or two. Okay, so after this, rook to d3 is played, and the idea here is we're going to protect the a3 pawn, but also this rook can come both defensively and offensively along this third rank. So it's kind of like a mini rook lift. I mean, this pawn on g3 is kind of blocking it, but the idea here is this f file is very important, and this rook can come there at some point. Okay, queen to f5, and now bishop to e5, putting a little extra protection in his pawn and offering this trade. Now, black wants to keep, as we mentioned earlier, black wants to keep this bishop on the board. Again, black is a pawn down, so he doesn't want to trade down into a losing endgame unless he can get it right. Now, this is very, even though we can say that white has an advantage, white has to be very careful because white has to be very careful because at this level, these elite players, a pawn might not be enough. If he could trade off the queens and the bishops, for example, the rook endgame might not be, might be very difficult. Of course, depends on the specific position, but I'm just speaking generally. So accuracy is still needed at this phase of the game. So let's see how Tal finishes this off. Queen to e2, of course, needs to stay in contact with this rook on d3, and rook to c8, and now the back rank, white has to be careful there. So here, a little trap here that is created here by Tal after queen to h3 with the idea of threatening the rook to c1. Probably Botvinnik was expecting that white would have to play his rook to e3 like this, and of course this would be a mistake. After queen to f5 would help basically black's active pieces kind of hold the position even though he's down a pawn. However, white has something much stronger in mind. So what I want you to do, again, pause this video and see if you came up with white's idea. I'll give you seconds to. Okay, I hope you guys took a look at that and found Tal's brilliant move here. Bishop to c7. Just putting his bishop right in the way of that rook. And let's, of course, hopefully you calculated this. If you found it, what happens if we take that bishop? Well, queen to e8 check. And of course, if bishop to f8, then we have queen takes f8 checkmate. And if the king moves to g7, for example, then white picks up the rook with this fork. Of course, black did not take bishop. Instead, he played bishop to f8. And here is the next brilliant move. Queen to b5, targeting these weak pawns. Of course, the major threat is queen takes d5 check. And again, we cannot take this bishop because queen to d5 check, king to g7, and again, queen to e5 check picks up that rook on c7. So instead, black plays queen to e6, protecting the d5 pawn. So now the bishop has to retreat, but of course the white king is safe now. So it's okay. King to c or queen to c5, and here white chooses not to trade. He plays queen to a5. Rook to a8 is played, and now here you might have thought to yourself, what happens after bishop takes a3 with the idea that rook takes a3, queen to c1 check, king to g2, and then picking up that rook here. Does that win a pawn? Well, it doesn't, because we look a little bit further. We have queen takes d5 check, king to f8, then bishop to d6 check, now forking the... So, of course, Botvinnik did not fall for that, so instead he played rook to a8. Queen to d2 is played, and rook to c8. King to g2 is played, queen to d7, and here Tal plays h4. The idea is that we're going to push this pawn up to h5 and disrupt kingside pawns, the protection around black's king even. So in the game, Botvinnik sealed queen to g4 for an adjournment, but he actually resigned before they resumed play. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that game. This was the second last game of that match, which Tal clinched the world championship in the next game, game 20. But this, I thought, was a really instructive game in terms of strategy, creating weaknesses, and with all of the tactical nuances for both sides that were in there. I really just enjoyed that game. Of course, Tal is known for his wild attacking game. I showed you some of that in the previous two games. But if you have suggestions for the final game of this little mini-series on Tal, leave it in the comments below. Otherwise, I will find what I think is an enjoyable game to show you next week. In any case, I will see you next time, and I hope you guys are all staying safe and healthy with everything that's going on, and hope you're having a chance to play some chess as well. Talk to you soon.